Hi guys, welcome back to another video. Today I'm sitting on my bed. Why? I don't know. Anyway, today isn't a book review, but the book that I'm basing this discussion on will be a review, probably in my next video, I don't know. Um, and I'm talking about Byron, his work, Don Juan. Byron wrote a few really long poems, books. Um, one of his first that I think that sort of made him famous was Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. I've read some of that. It's really cool. Don Juan I'm working through now. I'm on the third uh, book. Do they call them books? I'm on the third book of 12, I believe it is, and cantos. He calls them cantos. I guess like Dante does, but Byron's cantos here are much longer than Dante's. Um, they're about 200 verses long, not verses, stanzas long, which would be what, 1,000 lines, maybe? Something like that. Anyway, I'm really enjoying this poem. Um, Byron is a funny guy because he's not my cup of tea. Like, he's obviously a very good poet, and but I'm ashamed I like him, and I'm ashamed I like Shelley, and they're both cut from the same cloth. There are, what would you call them? I suppose womanizers. Not my cup of tea in terms of personality or what have you. Um, but you can't deny their, or at least I can't deny they're amazing poets. So, having started now into the third canto, probably about halfway through that, when I started that canto the other day, I was really blown away by the first 10 stanzas. And I believe, you'll probably see them floating by now. Uh, and I want to talk about them because they're on a theme that I am really interested in my own life. And I watch a lot of videos about dating and sexuality and all that stuff. Obviously, I have some videos I've made. Two of my favorite YouTubers on this theme I listen to quite often. My favorite is probably Strong Successful Male, and I've started watching this woman. Her site is called Just Pearly Things. Her first name is Pearl. I don't know what her last name is. I just started watching her maybe a week or so ago. Um, I watch a bunch of other YouTubers who talk about dating and marriage and stuff, but I just wanted to talk about them right now. And in particular, I just wanted to address one small thing that this Pearl said the other day. And I'm not saying that this was her position or is her position, but I am going to say that I disagree with it insofar as she presented it. And again, if she takes exception to this, great. But I really enjoy listening to her and her opinions and so on, and share a lot of them. So I'm going to talk about the idea of pair bonding and of, well, sometimes people call it alpha widowing. I don't like that phrase, but nevertheless, pair bonding, or you can just use the traditional phrase is first love, right? Turgenev wrote First Love, beautiful story, and that's basically what Byron is talking about in the first 10 or 11 uh, stanzas of this third canto. Okay, so basically, I'll give the outline of the storyline next in the video I devote to it, but he's just simply talking about first love here. Um, and I want to talk about conceptions and things that I consider misconceptions, maybe. Now, Pearl's statement was something like, or I should say, too closely associating pair bonding with sex, and that the inability of women to, or I should say, the tendency of one's ability or a woman's ability to form a long-lasting relationship is stands in inverse relation to the number of sexual partners she's had. And this is well researched. There's graphs everywhere that show this. It's not worth debating. Um, and I think it's important, nevertheless, to make sure, and this is the deception of the whole, the phrase alpha widow, because an alpha widow is when a woman has this amazing a relationship with a very what they call top tier man, so a man that's attractive, wealthy, confident, tall, all these things, and has very memorable or I should say significant sexual experiences with this so-called alpha. Now, tying alpha widowhood, which may be a real thing, into the pair bonding phenomenon is a bit of a mistake, or there's a dissimilarity in some of it, because pair bonding, although um, intimately tied into sexuality for a woman, and I think a lot of the observations that I say for a woman can be said for a man, but they're not exactly the same, and in some significant ways they're very different. So a woman, it's very often that a first love experience and a first sexual experience come from one and the same person, but that's not always the case. Obviously, one can be madly in love with a person that one's never had sex with, like as Byron will mention, uh, Dante was madly in love with Beatrice, Petrarch with Laura. He also draws a reference to Milton talking about Eve, but that's a different thing too. Um, and of course, my favorite little novella, "The Sorrows of Young Werther," uh, Werther, or in this case, you know, the Goethe character Werther, um, has never had a sexual relationship with um, uh, the object of his desire. What's her name? Anyway, I'll put it up here. Anyway, those of you who don't make videos, you don't understand that sometimes just the basic things you can't access in your brain. Um, so so what I'm saying is that sometimes uh, pair bonding is made through sexuality, and often is, because love and sexuality are often um, one leads to the other. But we know that definitely that's not always the case. And the significance of the sexual act in its emotional significance, its psychological significance, is truly important, and it's something that in the world in which I grew up, it was never talked about. And so there's a lot of unhappiness in the world today because uh, this basic fact of human psychology has been ignored. So anyway, whether you consider it a moral fact or not, it's at least a psychological fact. Okay, so um, when Pearl makes the statement about a woman not being able to pair bond, there's a connection that's made too intimately, I think, with an amazing sexual experience, as if the quality of sex is the driving force in terms of a woman's psychological adhesion to a man. Okay, so um, and that's something that I think is fundamentally unhelpful, and that in this day and age, when too much is tied to sex as a physical experience, which is supposed to have its own kind of excellence, um, you know, that that is but one little tiny portion of uh, the romantic phenomenon. right? The phenomenon of romance. So what I'm saying is that in love, in romance, the quality of sexuality is sort of equivalent to, the height of the partner, or whatever, the height of the man, or the I don't know, breast size of the woman. It has a it has a an effect, an impact, but it's kind of like, um, not it's kind of like straining a gnat to swallow a whatever, a camel, right? So what I'm saying is that it's very modern and very uh, androcentric to draw to look at the quality of the sexual experience as having something to do with first love, with pair bonding, and all that. And that indeed, I think that in the maturation of relationships, I'm not talking about good relationships or bad relationships. I'm just talking about a standard format or standard progression of a relationship. That relationships begin in the mind and the heart, and then they slowly, uh, I would say, devolve, decay into the physical. Okay, so they start as a notional phenomenon and decay into a physical phenomenon. So, in other words, what I'm saying is that the more attention that's paid to the quality of the sex act, then is being the less loving or romantic it is. Okay, that these two things are almost polar opposites. Okay, and I'm not saying that from a Christian's perspective. I'm not saying that from a Stoic perspective. I'm saying it from my observations, my own life experience, and my attentiveness to others' experiences, especially via these many YouTube videos and so on. My study of humanity. Okay, so um, if I'm criticizing Pearl, which I don't know if I really am, because I'm sure she would, I'm sure she would accept most of the things that I've said here. Um, I just wanted to draw a distinction between those two things. So, in case someone isn't really aware what pair bonding is, pair bonding is the idea that, uh, and it happens in a few species like birds or something, but in human beings, pair bonding is the said that it's something that happens through the loving, or the initiation of love. So I'd say that it's one's first experience of love, and that's very often tied into sexuality. And sex is psychologically impactful enough that it's often the catalyst or the occasion in which a bond is formed. Okay, and the longer the sexual relationship lasts, or the loving romantic relationship lasts, and the more fruitful and positive it is, then the less able will a person be to be able to move beyond that relationship psychologically, so to speak, to forget about the relationship and to move on to another person and to love them as if the other person is not still loved. Okay, I think a lot of this is common sense, but I think that common sense is sometimes uh, pushed to the side so that people can feel better about the bad decisions they make, or the situation in which they find themselves, because this current day and age is not very hospitable to love, very not very hospitable to romance. There's a lot of reasons for that, and I think the heyday of romance was somewhere around the year 1869, let's say. Why do I say such a silly thing? Well, I think that because marriage used to be simply a financial transaction of one very much geared to the sensible setting up of the family business, i.e., farming. Um, that love and romance was a silly notion that only poets talked about. And we're talking about not even the ancient Roman poets, but the Christian poets. Okay, so people like the troubadours in southern France were probably the first people to sort of really fit this notion of romance into its modern form, and it has early appearances in people like Dante and Petrarch, and then flowered and was nourished and became common sense that this is what marriage is supposed to be in the great flowering of the Romantic era. Okay, so in the great Romance poets, and it's not present in the 18th century novelists. If you'll notice that, still we have sort of the old-fashioned sort of marriage is utilitarian and sexual and all that stuff, and romance as an end in itself. That's a 19th century fascination and the highest fruit of their contemplation of the great romantic writers, people like Jane Austen and Tolstoy and these great romance writers. That there was and that era is over because there's no tension now between the will of the parents and the will of the lovers. Okay, parents no longer have a right to force people to marry, and that marriage is now untethered from social and especially familial expectations, and have become, almost inexplicable actions, given that Christian and Catholic sacramental theology plays almost no role anymore in the modern conception of romance and sexuality and marriage, um, and that things like the normalization of divorce, which is the first of Protestants, and then of the secularization of society, and then no fault divorce, and then contraception and abortion, uh, these things have removed all the tension that is necessary for romance to be such a powerful driving force. However, people are still people, and if you're raised in what a lot of YouTubers will say the Disney world of, you know, first love, first kiss, and Cinderella and Snow White and all these things, then you're going to be clinging to an old-fashioned Christian slash romantic era idea that has no more social force. So um, marriages can be entered and exited at will, and there's no religious metaphysic to underlie the world, and there's no sense of fate, destiny, um, and the peril of responsibility, or of, let's say, eternal responsibility. That stuff removes all the tension. Okay, part of the tension in the 19th century novelists is not simply that going against the parents' wishes, but also going against God's wishes. Okay, none of that plays a role anymore. So a novel about romance today is almost silly. Um, it can be looked at like a phenomenological or psychological thing, but it's stripped of its metaphysics. Okay, I'll leave that with you. You can think about that if that makes sense to you at all. So what we have now is uh, and when you look at it, I can see some YouTubers who talk about relationships and so on are influenced by Christianity. Um, I can think of one in particular, really cool guy. Um, and but most of the people who are concerned about the bad things that have crept into dating, marriage, and relationships and all that are coming at it from a simply you might call a utilitarian perspective, like what maximizes happiness, and they know now they it's becoming common knowledge. It's not common knowledge because of feminism, but it's becoming common knowledge that the way we're doing things now is not working. Okay, no fault divorce, and if a woman has control of the children, then men are divesting themselves from marriage. Because if they can't control the children, if they don't own the children or own the wife, and if the whole marriage and their whole life, their a man's whole life hangs upon the whim of a woman, that the courts sort of back up and say she can leave the marriage anytime without fault, and in fact often gets an economic reward, that she's the prima facie owner of the children, and in fact she can kill them too before they're born, and that creates a circumstance in which men have no vested interest in giving themselves to. Okay, so what do we do about that? Well, I don't care what people do about it. I don't care if Western society crashes and burns because it's not replicating itself. But I care about myself, and I care about the happiness of people I know, whether I know them because they live on my block or I know them from the YouTube world or whatever. You care about the people you know. You don't care about people you don't know, and that's a simple fact. So, what's good advice to give? Um, I say Byron gives some good advice, for instance. Byron is funny because how can you get truth from a cad, right? And that's the thing that I'm finding fascinating here. Byron didn't treat the women in his life, I don't think, with a great deal of um, respect. Okay, not in the notion in a notion of that I would say that's a respectful and loving, mutual, self-sacrificing kind of thing, right? So I'm going to talk now about a few things from these first 10 stanzas, and see how they illuminate or fail to illuminate the things that I've been saying here. Okay, so the second stanza begins, "O love, what is it in this world of ours which makes it fatal to be love? And why with cypress branches hast thou wreathed thy bowers, and made thy best interpreter a sigh?" Well, that's a really cool. That's a cool ex- expression. The best interpreter, a sigh, means I don't. I can't put in the words this thing called love, right? Um, and I also like that he says fatal to be loved. Okay, um, that this is not love is not a prudent uh, thing, right? It's not self-serving. It's not beneficial to a sensible, peaceful, productive, economically productive life. And the end of the stanza is, "And thus the frail beings we would fondly cherish are laid within our bosoms but to perish." Okay, all love perishes, he's telling us. That's just the nature of love. It doesn't last. And that's one thing, for instance, C.S. Lewis said in The Four Loves. He says, like, romantic love may be the strongest, but it's also the most, um, it's also the briefest, the most short-lived, right? Okay, let's look at this phrase. The first two lines of the third stanza say, in her first passion, woman loves her lover. In all the others, all she loves is love. Okay, that's cool. I like that. In her first passion, the woman is narrowed in on the man. The object of her desire, her fascination, is totally caught up with him as this unique individual. I think we've all experienced that, and we can all identify and agree with that. He says, in all the others, so every other time she loves, all she loves is love. So it becomes a more abstract thing removed from the individuality of the person. Okay? Doesn't it then become more like, oh, what can this person do for me? How can they make me feel? How do they take care of me? How do they make me feel sexually? How do they sexually gratify me, or whatever? Right? That's interesting. Um, at the end of that stanza, he says, one man alone at first her heart can move. She then prefers him in the plural number, not finding that the additions much encumber. Okay? So one man alone at first her heart can move. So basically, I'm saying that a person, he says a woman, but I say a person. A person can only love once, right? And that's why I like, for as annoying as it is and annoyingly seductive as it is, Celine Dion's the Titanic theme, um, uh, whatever it's called, you know, you can love but once, one time, one true time, right? I agree with that completely. Okay, um, I and it's a question. This is a relevant question. Is there a difference between men and women in this regard? I don't know. I'm assuming not. That the first love, fullest, completest sense of the word. I don't mean some little crush in junior high, but that it's a possibility. It could be that. Some people would say it's got to be your first sexual love, and I don't know about that. Um, I don't think always. I think for me, sexuality and love overlap, but they're not identical. Not in any sense of the word. That I agree that Dante truly loves Beatrice, and that Petrarch truly loves Laura. I agree, and they never had sex, and they never would have sex. Um, and again, but it's not to discountenance the powerful effect sexuality has. Okay, I grant that. And I think there's a very different thing that sex has physiologically, or I should say psychologically, on a woman than a man. Right? I think that's important to distinguish as well. Okay, let's move on a little bit here. Um, Although no doubt her first of love affairs is that to which her heart is wholly granted. Um, but those who have ne'er end with only one. There's only one love, and it lasts, and you're not getting over it, basically. Okay, so in the fifth stanza, he begins to focus on the relationship between love and marriage. Um, they don't go together like a horse and carriage. Ask the local gentry. Okay, um, he says, "'Tis melancholy and a fearful sign of human frailty, folly, also crime, that love and marriage rarely can combine, although they are both born of the same clime." Okay, yeah, they come from the same place usually, and love can turn into marriage. And in fact, marriage can turn into love too. Um, I think that then he goes on to say, "Marriage from love, like vinegar from wine." Okay, so marriage will always sour. Okay, he says in six, passion in a lover is glorious, but in a husband is pronounced uxorious. And he goes on the first line of the seventh stanza. Um, Men grow ashamed of being so very fond. Okay, and that's interesting because marriage lasts, right? It's supposed to last till death and all that, and usually it doesn't in today's day and age. Um, but as I know at 47, I'm not the man I was at 17 or 27 or 37, and that I'm kind of embarrassed as I look back on my immaturity at those ages. And I think most men do, and they say, ugh, you know, what was I thinking then, or how immature I was, and so on. So, I mean, even if someone still loves his wife after 30 years, he's still kind of embarrassed about his immaturity and so on. And the lengths to which he went in service of his beloved, right? And that's pretty normal, and it's pretty funny too. Um, he goes on the eighth stanza. There's doubtless something in domestic doings which forms, in fact, true love's antithesis. Isn't that interesting? He says, marriage itself, because it's so oriented to the mundane, of course it's going to annihilate love, right? It's the opposite of love, right? Love is impractical and irrational. Marriage is practical and rational. Okay, we know this. If you've been married for any length of time, you know this. Um, he says, "Think you, if Laura had been Petrarch's wife, he would have written sonnets all his life?" That's a question. He says, he says he would, but would he? Would he have written sonnets all his life? And the answer is no, he wouldn't. that I think it's interesting if you take, for instance, Tolstoy. Um, he began, his early works, Family Happiness, Cossacks, even Childhood, Boyhood, Youth, and of course War and Peace. There's a gradual devolution into cynical treatments of marriage that we find, for instance, in Anna Karenina, Resurrection, the Kreutzer Sonata, um, and the Death of Ivan Ilyich. It's so mama. So I can't think like of any poet. Look at Goethe. That he never. There was a rationalization, I think, in Goethe's progression as well, that he could have never written the Sorrows of Young Werther at a later age, right? And that Elective Affinities, for instance, has a very different approach to romance than the earlier work. And I'm wondering if there's any poet that we can say is an exception to that rule. I wonder if the Brownings are. I don't know their poetry well enough to be able to say, but I think it would be very strange. Now, one person I'm thinking of again is C.S. Lewis, because his history was so peculiar, wasn't it? That he fell in love at a very late stage in his life, and his wife died tragically of cancer. So he's very funny, sort of funny exception to the rule, right? And then the ninth stanza is interesting. It goes back to my point that there's something very Christian about the whole romance thing. He says, "All tragedies are finished by a death. All comedies are ended by a marriage." Uh, Interesting, eh? So, yeah, you think of Shakespeare's comedies, how marriage is an end point. That when the couple gets together, the play's over. Okay, um, Romeo and Juliet's a tragedy because death. Hamlet's a tragedy because death. Right? All comedies are ended by marriage. He goes on to say that for authors fear description might disparage the worlds to come of both or fall beneath, um, and so on. He says in the 10th stanza, and the last one I'll be looking at, he says, "The only two that in my recollection have sung of heaven or hell or marriage are Dante and Milton. And of both the affection was hapless in their nuptials, for some bar or fault or temper ruined the connection." such things in fact. It don't ask much to mar. But Dante's Beatrice and Milton's Eve were not drawn from their spouses, you conceive. Okay, so I think it's really interesting, and I don't think Byron is aware of the Christian influence of romance. Romance is a Christian notion, or I should say, it's a notion that couldn't have developed without Christianity. And I've talked about this before in different places. Check out some of the other videos in this thing, and if people are super miffed by what I said, I can talk more about it later. Um, that he at least like Byron at least had the sense like who even talked about love in an eternal, in a lasting way, right? Not Shakespeare. He ends his plays, the comedies, with a marriage. There's nothing to talk about afterwards. And that's one thing I noticed when I was a teenager was that I used to watch a soap opera, and marriages never lasted. And if you look, for instance, it's almost like with the series The Walking Dead. Anyone who's too happy is about to die. Okay, again and again. Anyone who's too happy is about to die in The Walking Dead. And in a soap opera, anyone who's married, that's kind of a pause in their storyline, or they're not going to be married for very long. So marriage gets them off the show, or the marriage isn't going to last because there's nothing to talk about in a marriage when people get married. So Byron's instincts are correct in pointing in leading him to these Christian authors, these extremely Christian authors, Dante and Milton, and yet Byron has this sort of this smirk, the smart observation. He says he didn't get like Dante in their image, in their image of true and perfect love. Dante has of Beatrice and Milton has of Eve. He said uh, they were not drawn from their spouses, you conceive. And yeah, I don't. If you know anything about Dante's life or Milton's life, yeah, that's certainly true. Dante doesn't seem to have loved his wife. You know, his wife was arranged. It was an arranged marriage, like everything in his day and age. Um, he even named one of his children Beatrice. He names one of his daughters with his wife after the other woman he's in love with, Beatrice. Okay. He had every right to do so. He owned the children, and the marriage was a marriage of convenience, like every marriage was in those days. Arranged marriage. But obviously, the human spirit wants something more. But romance and marriage, like if you look, for instance, at uh, the 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 chivalry literature, think of Lancelot. Lancelot's not married to what's her name, Guinevere. Uh, that's King Arthur's wife. If I got the name wrong, I'll apologize here. But love and marriage have basically nothing to do with each other because in the Middle Ages and before that, and somewhat after that, marriages were contracts of economic and sometimes political advantage. That's it. That's all. Um, and you know, so Dante was easily able to love a woman to whom he wasn't married, and in fact, it was almost it's almost kind of repulsive that one would love one's wife. And Milton's Eve, Milton very quickly, his first wife left him, and then he divorced her. I think he was married a second time, and this, his Milton had a weird personality too. I guess every poet does, but his idealization of Eve is amazing. I highly recommend you read. I can't remember which book of Paradise Lost it is. It's easy enough to look up, but his discussion of Eve and his description of Adam and Eve's life in the Garden of Eden is truly remarkable. Um, These were not drawn from their spouses. Okay, so marriage is in the practical orbit of things, and romance is in an impractical, idealistic realm. The 19th century novelists tried to merge them, and they thought it was all the only thing that stood in the way was parents. The parents arranging marriages was the only impediment to the merger of the practical and the romantic. We see now, 100 years later, 150 in some cases, that that's not the case. That didn't. That just removing parents' interference doesn't solve anything, or it doesn't solve much. Anyway, so when we started this discussion, we're talking about sex versus love. We're talking about first love. We're talking about pair bonding, and the the not. I mean, Byron calls it an antithesis. I don't know what I would call it. They're definitely not identical. Uh, there's some overlap between love and marriage, sure. Uh, Byron says there is no overlap. Um, and so, but the idea of, and what role does sexuality play in this? That first love needn't be sexual, you know. Turgenev, Tolstoy, um, Dante, Petrarch, none of them thought that love and sex were codependent or intertwined. If you go back and look at Ovid, as a pagan, a pre-Christian, he links them more closely together than do the Christians, right? And that's something worth paying attention to. And we look back at Ovid and we say he's not talking about love, he's talking about lust. But as long as we can say that without the Christian judgment there, right? It's simply an objective state. He's not talking about love. Ovid's not talking about love. He's talking about lust in the Christian sense of the word. But again, I'm not saying it's wrong morally. I'm just saying physiologically, existentially, phenomenologically, totally different. Okay? Now, this is the post-Christian world we're in now. And having been impacted by Christianity and wanting this merger between love and marriage, or love and sex, we see it disintegrating. Right? We see it pulling apart, not for the reasons that the Christians pulled them apart or Ovid pulled them apart, but for very unique reasons that I said have a lot to do with there's no metaphysics anymore. There's no eternity. There's no objective morality. And there's no social, there's no what we call the super ego. So the conception of the world, the super ego is not telling us that we need to merge love and marriage. We need to look to merge love and marriage and sex and desire altogether. There's no metaphysics for that anymore. So what we have is psychology. We're left with psychology, physiology, and we think that the whole thing can be a product of the will, right? That we can even change our sexual identity or our sexual reality by choice. Now, that's silly, but it's a very modern notion. It's the vacuum. These things can rush into the vacuum created by pushing the Christian romance out. So romance is intrinsically Christian. Once you push that out, then you're left with a gaping void, and you want to say that the will is sufficient to merge romance, sex, and marriage. It's not. And we're seeing the fruit of this now. Anyway, I really enjoyed these stanzas in Byron, and I'm really enjoying Don Juan, and I'll talk to you about it in the future. 45-minute video. Wow. Okay. Thanks so much, everybody. I hope you get something out of this. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to sort of talk about it again later, or if you write a comment, I'll try and answer you. Thanks, guys. Hope you're having a great day. And we'll talk to you later.